August 15th, 1971, Richard Nixon went on television and told the world that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. It was, by any definition, a default. America had promised the world, in writing at Bretton Woods in 1944, that every dollar could be redeemed for gold at $35 an ounce. That promise was the foundation of the entire global financial system. And Nixon broke it in 15 minutes on a Sunday night. Without consulting a single allied government, the dollar should have fallen. Every financial model said it would. Every economist expected it. The currencies of nations that break their promises don't survive. They don't go on to dominate the world for another 50 years. And yet, 2 years later, the dollar didn't just survive, it became more untouchable than it had ever been under the gold standard. More countries needed it. More trade was denominated in it. More governments held it in reserve. How? That is the question this documentary answers. Because somewhere between Nixon's confession in 1971 and the oil fires burning in the Strait of Hormuz right now in 2026, there was a deal. A secret deal. Made in a series of meetings between diplomats who understood that whoever controlled the world's energy controlled the world's money. For 50 years, that deal held. The question is whether it just broke. To understand what Nixon did in August of 1971, you have to understand what the world looked like the morning before he did it. Every nation on Earth had built its financial system on a single assumption. The United States had the gold, and the gold backed the dollar, and the dollar backed everything else. It was a hierarchy of trust. At the top sat Fort Knox. At the bottom sat every transaction, every salary, every trade deal, every government bond issued anywhere in the world. The system was called Bretton Woods, and it had governed global finance since the summer of 1944, when 44 nations signed their names to it in a hotel in New Hampshire, still 3 years from the end of the war. The deal was simple. America held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. America would peg the dollar to gold at $35 an ounce. Every other currency would peg to the dollar. In exchange, the United States would be the anchor of the global financial order. For 20 years, it worked. Then America started running out of gold. In the spring of 1965, a French civil servant named Henri Lebrun received a letter from his government's finance ministry. It contained instructions he had never seen before. Begin converting France's dollar reserves into gold. Quietly, systematically, without drawing attention. Lebrun didn't know why. He just followed orders. What he didn't know was that the man who gave those orders, Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, had looked at America's balance sheets and concluded, privately, that the dollar was already broken. The receipts were no longer worth the paper they were printed on. Lebrun spent the next 6 years converting francs into gold bars. By 1971, France held the largest gold reserves in Western Europe outside of the United States. Giscard called it the exorbitant privilege, the ability of America to spend beyond its means and make the rest of the world pay for it. He was right, and he saw it coming years before Nixon admitted it. The Korean War had cost money. The Vietnam War cost more. President Johnson's Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, federal education funding, cost more still. America was spending beyond its means, printing dollars to cover the gap, and the world noticed. European central banks began quietly converting their dollar reserves back into gold. Charles de Gaulle, in a famous press conference in 1965, declared that gold was the only true monetary standard and that France would not hold paper promises from any government. He sent a French warship to New York to pick up France's gold in person. He didn't trust paper. By 1971, America's gold reserves had fallen from 20,000 tons to 8,000 tons. Foreign governments held more dollars than America had gold to back them. The promise was broken before Nixon said a word. When Nixon went on television that Sunday night, he called it a temporary suspension. He said it was necessary to defend the dollar against speculators. He made it sound like a technical adjustment, a minor procedural measure, nothing to worry about. In the weeks that followed, the dollar did exactly what everyone expected. It fell. Against the German mark, it dropped 12% in a week. Against gold, trading freely now for the first time in decades, it plummeted. Inflation, already building, accelerated. The purchasing power of every dollar held by every person, every government, every central bank in the world was being quietly diluted. The world had trusted America with its savings. America had just told the world, the receipt you're holding is no longer redeemable. This is the moment the petrodollar story begins. Not with the deal itself, but with the crisis that made the deal necessary. Because what Nixon destroyed in August 1971, Kissinger was quietly rebuilding by the end of 1973. Not on gold. On something more valuable, more strategic, and ultimately more fragile. On oil. In October of 1973, the Arab members of OPEC declared an oil embargo against the United States. It was retaliation for American support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War, and it worked with terrifying efficiency. Within weeks, oil prices had quadrupled. American gas stations ran dry. Drivers sat in lines that stretched for city blocks. The economy, already weakened by the dollar's fall, lurched toward recession. The embargo lasted 5 months. When it ended, the world of 1972 was gone. America had a problem. It needed oil. The entire industrial economy ran on it. And the countries that had the oil, Saudi Arabia above all, had just demonstrated they were willing to use it as a weapon. Henry Kissinger saw the problem differently. He didn't see an energy crisis. He saw a negotiating opportunity. In June of 1974, a Treasury Department official named Jack Bennett boarded a plane to Riyadh, carrying a briefcase and a set of instructions that had been classified at the highest level. Bennett was not a diplomat. He was a numbers man, a financial technician who understood bond markets and reserve management better than almost anyone in Washington. His job was to present the Saudi Finance Ministry with a proposal. America would create a secret channel through which Saudi Arabia could purchase U.S. Treasury bonds in amounts that would never be disclosed to Congress or the public. The arrangement would be managed off the books, outside the normal reporting requirements that governed foreign sovereign purchases. Bennett sat across the table from Saudi officials for 3 days. He drank tea. He answered questions. He explained, patiently, how the mechanism would work and why it would benefit both sides. When he flew home, the deal was done. It would not be revealed to the American public until 2016, when Bloomberg News filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the National Archives 42 years later. One of the most consequential financial arrangements in modern history had been hidden in plain sight for 4 decades. In June of 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia signed what was publicly described as a broad agreement on military and economic cooperation. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Saudi officials were present at the ceremony in Washington. What emerged from the public agreement and the private arrangements surrounding it was a structure that would reshape the global financial order. Note carefully what the historians have established. The petrodollar system was not a single secret treaty with a fixed expiration date. That version of the story is a simplification. What Kissinger engineered, according to UBS economist Paul Donovan and historian David White of the University of Notre Dame, was a web of mutually reinforcing incentives: military security for Saudi Arabia, a reliable market for American debt, and a global pricing convention that locked in dollar demand. The deal had two visible sides. The United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military protection, weapons, training, security guarantees. The kingdom that sat on the largest oil reserves in the world would never need to fear invasion or regional rivals as long as America was its partner. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would price its oil in US dollars, as it largely already did. And critically, it would invest the enormous surplus revenues generated by oil sales back into US Treasury bonds. Between 1974 and 1976 alone, Saudi purchases of American government bonds accounted for 12% of the entire US federal deficit. America was borrowing from the country it had just agreed to protect. Think about what this meant. Every country in the world needed oil. Every country that needed oil had to buy it in dollars, which meant every country had to hold dollar reserves. Not because they trusted Nixon, not because they believed in American fiscal discipline, but because they had no choice. The gas station only accepted one currency. This is the fact that most financial histories skim past. The dollar's dominance after 1971 was not a natural market outcome. It was engineered through a series of diplomatic arrangements that gave Saudi Arabia security and gave America something worth more than gold: a captive global customer for its currency. And here is the detail that changes how you see everything that follows. In the months before these arrangements were finalized, Saudi Arabia had been conducting parallel conversations with the Soviet Union. Moscow was offering its own security guarantees. The Soviets wanted access to Saudi oil revenues. The Saudis were genuinely weighing their options. One set of meetings, one arrangement, one decision. That is the margin by which the petrodollar was born, and by which the dollar survived the death of Bretton Woods. Here is something that takes a moment to fully absorb. After 1974, the United States could run a budget deficit, spend more than it collected in taxes, and instead of suffering the consequences that would destroy any other economy, it could distribute the pain across the entire world. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a structural feature of how the system worked. When America printed dollars to cover its spending, those dollars didn't stay in America. They flowed into global trade because the world needed dollars to buy oil. Every country that ran a trade surplus with the United States accumulated those dollars. They held them in reserve. They bought American Treasury bonds with them, which meant they were effectively lending money back to America so America could keep spending. It was a closed loop. America spent. The world needed dollars. The world recycled dollars back into American debt. America borrowed at artificially low rates because demand for its bonds was structurally guaranteed. And the inflation that would normally result from excessive spending was distributed across every country that held dollar reserves. France's Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called it the exorbitant privilege. The ability of the United States to borrow in its own currency and run deficits that would be catastrophically destructive for any other nation. The numbers confirm it. From 1971 to 2024, the United States ran a current account deficit in every single year but one. 53 consecutive years of spending beyond its means. The total accumulated external deficit is measured in tens of trillions of dollars. No other country in history has done this without a currency crisis. America did it because the world had no choice but to keep accepting dollars. And now, in 2026, the mechanism is under the most severe stress it has faced since the oil embargo of 1973. The IMF has cut global growth forecasts. Oil is above $125 a barrel. Countries that built their energy budgets on affordable oil are facing inflation spikes they cannot control. The system that distributed America's inflation to the world is straining at every joint, which raises the question that every finance minister in the world is quietly asking right now. What happens when the mechanism breaks? Imagine you run a country. Your factories need oil to run. Your trucks need diesel to move goods. Your power plants need fuel to keep the lights on. Every morning, before your economy produces a single thing, you need energy. And energy, since the mid-1970s, has been invoiced in dollars. So you need dollars. Not because you want them. Not because you trust the Federal Reserve. Not because you think American economic management is sound. You need them because the gas station, every gas station on Earth, only accepts one currency. This is the mechanical core of petrodollar dominance. To maintain dollar reserves, countries had to earn them by exporting goods to America or other dollar-earning economies, which meant structuring their entire trade policy around access to dollar markets, which meant tolerating American trade deficits, because American deficit spending was what put dollars into global circulation in the first place. The system was elegant in its self-reinforcement. America spent. Dollars flowed out. The world collected them. The world needed more as oil demand grew. The world bought American bonds with the surplus. American borrowing costs stayed low. America could spend more. In 1979, a factory manager named Kim Jae-won was running one of South Korea's largest steel mills in Pohang. The mill consumed roughly 80,000 barrels of oil per month. Every barrel was invoiced in dollars. Every month, Kim had to secure dollar reserves before he could keep the furnaces burning. He didn't think of himself as part of a global financial system. He thought of himself as a man trying to make steel, but every decision he made, what to export, where to sell, which banks to work with, what contracts to sign, was shaped by the need to accumulate American dollars. Kim's mill was one of thousands across Asia doing the same calculation. Together, the industrial economies of South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and eventually China were running their entire economic models around a single imperative: earn enough dollars to keep buying the oil that kept the factories running. The petrodollar wasn't an abstraction to Kim Jae-won. It was the reason he came to work every morning. At the center of the entire architecture stood a geographic fact so simple it seems almost absurd. The Strait of Hormuz, 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, shared between Iran on one side and Oman on the other. Through this sliver of water passes on average 21 million barrels of oil every single day. 20% of the world's entire oil supply, 40% of all globally traded liquefied natural gas. If the Strait closes, the mechanism breaks, not weakens, not slows down, breaks. Japan has no domestic oil. It imports nearly all of it through the Strait. South Korea does too. India, Taiwan, China, the entire industrial base of East Asia runs on energy that flows through 33 kilometers of water that Iran can, in a crisis, interdict. This is what happened in the early months of 2026. And this is why the financial markets reacted not just with a spike in oil prices, but with something deeper. A re-evaluation of the assumptions that had underpinned the petrodollar system for 50 years. Because here is what most coverage of the Hormuz crisis missed. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would begin accepting euros for oil sales under the United Nations Oil for Food program. He called it an act of defiance. Economists dismissed it as symbolic. Iraq's output was too small to matter systemically. In March of 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. One of the first acts of the coalition administration was to switch Iraqi oil sales back to dollars. The pattern of that specific period is historical by fact. Whether it constitutes a deliberate policy of defending petrodollar primacy through military means remains contested among historians. What is not contested is the timing or the outcome. By the early 2000s, the fractures in the petrodollar system were appearing from a direction that couldn't be addressed through diplomatic pressure. China had been running massive trade surpluses with the world for 2 decades, accumulating trillions in dollar reserves. And quietly, methodically, it had been building an alternative financial architecture, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, bilateral currency swap agreements with dozens of countries that allowed trade to be settled without dollars, and gold. Since 2010, China has been the world's largest gold producer, and it exports almost none of it. Every ounce stays in China. Additionally, the People's Bank of China has been purchasing gold on international markets in a pattern that the World Gold Council described in its February 2026 report as 15 consecutive months of reserve additions. China's officially reported gold holdings reached 2,308 tons in January 2026, representing 9.6% of its total reserve assets. Most analysts believe the true figure is significantly higher, as China has a history of disclosing purchases only after extended periods. To put that in context, the United States built the gold reserves that backed Bretton Woods over decades. China has been building a comparable position in roughly 15 years. In 2009, Gaddafi proposed to the African Union a gold-backed pan-African currency, the gold dinar, that African oil producers would use to price their exports. According to an April 2011 email from advisor Sidney Blumenthal to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, declassified and publicly available through WikiLeaks, French intelligence identified Gaddafi's 143 tons of gold reserves as a direct threat to the France's dominance in Francophone Africa. The email cited this as one of the factors influencing France's decision to support NATO intervention in Libya. Gaddafi was removed from power in 2011. The gold dinar proposal died with him. Whether these events constitute a deliberate strategy to defend dollar primacy, or whether they reflect the convergence of unrelated geopolitical calculations, is something historians continue to debate. Financial Trail presents the documented record. The conclusions, as always, are yours to draw. Early 2026, the United States and Israel conduct coordinated strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran deploys mines and naval vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. For the first time in the history of the modern oil economy, the world's most critical energy corridor is closed. Oil prices reach above $125 a barrel within 72 hours. The IMF revises global growth forecasts downward. Japan declares an energy emergency. South Korea activates strategic petroleum reserves. The European Central Bank meets in an unscheduled session. And in the background, quieter than the news cycle, Iran announces that it will only accept yuan and gold for any oil moving through channels it controls, not dollars. For 50 years since the arrangements of 1974, the answer to that sentence had been dollars. Iran just changed the answer. Now, before we go further, Financial Trail needs to be precise. Iran's move alone does not end the petrodollar. One country, even one controlling the world's most critical shipping lane, cannot unilaterally dismantle a system built over 50 years. The dollar still denominated the vast majority of global oil transactions. The United States still has the world's deepest capital markets. As of early 2026, according to the Federal Reserve's International Role of the Dollar report, the dollar comprised 58% of disclosed global foreign exchange reserves, far ahead of the euro at 20% and the Chinese renminbi at just 2%. But here is what the 2026 crisis revealed that 50 years of uninterrupted operation had obscured. In late February of 2026, a shipping logistics coordinator named Maria Santos was working in a Rotterdam Port Authority office when the news broke that the Strait had been closed. Her job was to route tankers. Within an hour of the announcement, she was on calls with 12 different shipping companies trying to calculate whether rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope was financially viable. The numbers didn't work. A voyage that normally took 30 days would now take 52. The additional fuel cost alone at current oil prices made the cargo uneconomical. By the end of that day, Santos had been forced to cancel 7 shipments that could not be rerouted. The goods those tankers were carrying, electronics components, raw materials, petrochemicals, were already under contract to factories in Germany, South Korea, and the United States. Every cancellation set off a chain of missed deliveries, broken contracts, and rising costs that would eventually appear on consumer price indexes 3 months later. Santos didn't work in finance. She worked in shipping. But what she experienced that day was the petrodollar system failing in real time. Not in an abstract policy paper, but in the spreadsheet in front of her. The petrodollar system was always dependent on one thing above all else: the belief that the Strait of Hormuz would always be open, that oil would always flow, that the mechanism would never be seriously interrupted. That belief is no longer universal. The shipping insurance markets understood this within hours of the closure. Premiums for tankers operating in the Persian Gulf rose sharply. Some routes became extremely difficult to insure. Ships began rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and tens of thousands of dollars in fuel costs to every voyage. The cost of every product made with oil, which is to say, nearly every product, began to rise in every country on Earth. And in the financial markets, for the first time since the 1970s, investors began asking a question they had stopped asking decades ago. What backs the dollar now? It is the same question that European finance ministers asked in 1971 after Nixon broke the Bretton Woods promise. The last time the world asked that question, Henry Kissinger answered it with a deal made in a series of private meetings in a capital city in the desert. This time, there is no Kissinger. And the deal is being renegotiated, not in meeting rooms, but in the decisions of central banks quietly buying gold, in the routing of tankers around new sea lanes, and in the invoices that no longer say dollars. This is not the first time the world has asked that question. In history, which is what Financial Trail follows above all else, has answered it with a consistency that should give anyone pause. Every monetary empire ends the same way. Not suddenly, not with a single event. Through the gradual erosion of the trust that made the currency valuable, followed eventually by a moment when the erosion becomes visible to everyone at once. The Dutch guilder was the world's reserve currency in the 17th century. The Dutch East India Company was the most valuable corporation in history, controlling the global spice trade, running its own military. And then the wars of the late 17th century drained the Dutch treasury. The monopolies weakened. By the mid-18th century, the guilder had been replaced by the pound sterling. The British pound dominated for over 100 years. Sterling was used in 60% of global trade at the height of the British Empire. Then 2 world wars destroyed the British treasury. At Bretton Woods in 1944, the pound yielded to the dollar. The pattern across 3 centuries of monetary history is consistent. Reserve currencies end when the issuing nation runs persistent deficits it cannot close. When alternative powers accumulate enough strength to offer a credible substitute. And when a crisis event shatters the assumption of stability. In 2026, a historian looking at the available data would observe that all 3 conditions appear to be present simultaneously for the first time since the late 1960s. This is not a prediction. It is a pattern. While the Strait of Hormuz dominated the headlines in early 2026, a quieter story was unfolding in the data. China's official gold holdings reached 2,308 tons in January 2026, according to the World Gold Council, representing 9.6% of its total reserve assets and 15 consecutive months of reported additions. China has not publicly disclosed purchases since May 2024, yet analysts at Goldman Sachs, as reported in November 2025, maintain projections for continued institutional demand at approximately 80 tons per month through 2026. The true figure, most analysts believe, is higher than what Beijing reports. To understand why this matters, the United States built the gold reserves that backed the Bretton Woods system over 3 decades. China has been building a comparable position in roughly 15 years. Russia, after being excluded from the dollar system by sanctions, accelerated its own shift. Russian oil is now priced in rubles and yuan for its primary buyers. India pays for Russian oil in rupees. Saudi Arabia, the original counterparty of the petrodollar arrangements, began accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases in 2023 and signed a $7 billion economic cooperation agreement with China that same year. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the members added in 2024 now represent over 40% of global GDP by purchasing power. They have established the new development bank as an alternative to the IMF and World Bank. They are developing cross-border payment systems that bypass SWIFT. None of this by itself is sufficient to replace the dollar. The yuan is not freely convertible. Chinese capital markets are not deep enough for foreign governments to hold the reserves they keep in US treasuries. The infrastructure of dollar dominance, legal frameworks, banking relationships, trading conventions built over 80 years cannot be replicated quickly. But here's the detail that financial historians will study carefully. China stopped publicly reporting its gold purchases in May 2024. It resumed reporting in late 2024. But analysts widely believe the pause masked purchases that were significantly larger than what had been previously disclosed. When a major economy goes quiet about its gold buying, it is usually because the scale has become politically sensitive. The United States went quiet about Fort Knox in the 1960s for similar reasons. History gives us a laboratory for this question. When the pound sterling lost its reserve status in the late 1940s, Britain experienced what economists call a sudden stop, a rapid withdrawal of foreign capital that had been held in sterling. The pound devalued. Imports became more expensive. Living standards fell. The British government needed an IMF bailout in 1976, a humiliation unimaginable 20 years earlier. When Britain still commanded an empire, Britain survived. It adapted. But the transition was painful, prolonged, and profoundly disorienting for a society that had grown accustomed to being the center of the financial world. The United States is not Britain. America's economy is vastly larger. Its military remains without peer. Its technological base is still the most innovative in the world. The dollar has structural advantages that took decades to build. But here is what the history of monetary transitions tells us consistently. The pain is not distributed equally. When a reserve currency weakens, the people who suffer first are those with the least capacity to protect themselves. Savings lose purchasing power. Import prices rise. Interest rates increase to defend the currency. Mortgages become more expensive. The wealthy hold assets, real estate, gold, foreign stocks, businesses that generate income across multiple currencies. The mechanisms of monetary transition are, historically, engines of wealth concentration. Weimar's inflation of 1923 destroyed the German middle class, while those who had moved assets abroad remained largely intact. The British devaluation of the late 1940s hit pensioners and savers hardest. Every Argentine default has followed the same pattern. The Brookings Institution, in its January 2026 report, noted that 32% of American households believed their financial situation would worsen in the coming year, the highest level of financial pessimism since 2018. They may be sensing something that the official data has not yet fully captured. In 1974, a series of quiet diplomatic arrangements gave America 50 years of financial dominance. The system those arrangements created worked so well that most Americans never knew it existed. It allowed the United States to run deficits without consequences, borrow at artificially low rates, and remain the indispensable center of global trade and finance. Not because of gold, but because of oil, and the dollar-denominated system built around it. And now, in 2026, the Strait of Hormuz is reopening, slowly, partially, under a ceasefire that nobody fully trusts. And the world is trying to calculate what comes next. The petrodollar system is not dead. The dollar still dominates 58% of global foreign exchange reserves, according to the Federal Reserve's most recent data. But the Hormuz closure exposed what 50 years of uninterrupted operation had allowed everyone to forget. The system rests on the assumption that oil will always flow, that the arrangement will always hold, that the stability will never be seriously tested. It was tested. The central banks that have been quietly accumulating gold are watching. The governments that have been building alternative payment systems are watching. The countries that have been invoicing oil in currencies other than dollars are watching. Financial Trail does not tell you what will happen next. What we tell you is what has happened before. Every monetary empire that held the world's reserve currency believed the arrangement was permanent. The Dutch believed it. The British believed it. And at every transition, the world did not end. But the pain of adjustment fell hardest on those who were unprepared, those who didn't see it coming, those who assumed that what had always been true would always remain true. The pattern is not a prediction, it is a trail. And the trail leads here. To the question that every episode of Financial Trail returns to, not as a provocation, not as a warning, but as the honest conclusion of following the money through 50 years of history.
Is America next?
The trail doesn't end here. There are patterns still unexamined, mechanisms still unexplored, economic autopsies that history recorded and the present has forgotten. If you want to be there when the next trail is uncovered, activate the notification bell right now. Not just subscribe, the bell. Because the algorithm will not always surface these documentaries when you need them. The bell is the only way to make sure you don't miss what comes next. The money always leaves a trail. We'll follow it together.